Okay, welcome everyone to Investing Ideas, the power of public research. We're going to have a session for the next 90 minutes or so talking about funding university research and tech transfer and get into Bayh-Dole and a number of other issues that are key important topics today given uh, the current political environment and what's happening with university funding. I'm going to let each of the panelists introduce themselves and if they're connected to the organization they're from. And we'll start off with Julia Jester from AAU. Julia.
Thank you. Thanks for having me today. My name is Julia Jester, and I am a part of the Government Relations and Public Policy team at AAU. AAU is a member association for research universities. We have both public and private research institutions that are our members. We have 71 different members. And I work on kind of a broad array of policy issues, and one of those being research funding that comes from our agencies to our universities. So I will pass back to you, Josh.
Thanks, Julia. Catalina Izazo.
Hello, my name is Catalina Izaza. I'm a co-founder of Inmetec. I'm from Colombia. Inmetec, it's a company that was born in a university here in Colombia after a research and development process. We develop custom bone implants in different materials to replace a bone. And well, yes, I have the experience of transfer technology from the university to the market, and thank you for having me here.
Thank you, Catalina. Mark Robro.
Hello, I'm Mark Rohrbaugh. I'm retired from the National Institutes of Health. I was formerly the special advisor for technology transfer innovation to the Office of the Director and also the director of the Office of Technology Transfer.
Thanks, Mark. And then last but certainly not least, Stephen Sisolka.
Hey, everybody. My name is Steve Susalka. I'm the CEO of Autumn. Autumn is a nonprofit association focused on growing and advancing technology transfer and knowledge transfer worldwide. So our members, we have about 3,000 of them, and they hail from virtually every research-intensive institution in the United States, and then actually members in 65 countries around the world. And so again, our members are focused on taking that key federal funding and research that's occurring at universities, research institutions, and hospitals, and turning that into the products and services of tomorrow.
Thank you, Steve. Then for the audience, I've got a set of questions which I'm going to go through the panelists with, but we're also certainly happy to take questions from you. You can either type questions in the chat or use the Q&A function, and we'll be keeping track of those and answering them either after we've gone through the base questions, or if it makes sense on a timing basis, we'll go as they come in. So feel free to ask questions as they come up. So as a starting question, sort of a basic grounding question is for why we're here. So why does the federal government fund university research? And Julia, why don't you go first, and then Stephen, and then Mark.
Sure. Yeah, no, it's a great question. And it's a question that is very timely because I think a lot of folks are asking the question, as well as the additional question of what is the appropriate amount of funding that should go to universities and what portion of a university's budget should come from federal sources. I mean, the very, very short history, and I'm sure Steve can explain this much better than I, but about 75 years ago, there was an agreement that took place in part because of Sputnik and competition with the Russians that we needed more science and technology activity in our country. And one of the ways to do that was to provide support for people to go to college to study STEM fields. And part of that whole endeavor included the creation of a partnership where the government would fund universities to do work that they wanted to do because they found that that was an efficient way to get it done. So it's an interesting mix, but I like to think of that relationship as very enduring, productive, and one that is like a contract between the federal government and the university. It's not that the federal government gives the money to the university and says, bye-bye. This is something the federal government would want to do itself, but it doesn't necessarily have the infrastructure to do it. And that was a decision made in around the era of 1950s. And so the university does the research on behalf of the government, and the product is to the public of the outcome of that research. Steve?
Yeah, so that's a great overview. And so, as Julia rightly pointed out, this was decided, close to 75, 80 years ago, where it was a recognition that companies are excellent at bringing research to the market. However, they're commercially driven. And a lot of research evolves out of basic research. And I see, just looking at the participant list, we have a number of different professors and other people in academia. So the recognition that a lot of research that occurs at universities is really basic, but that will be what evolves into applied research downstream. So it was a recognition that the federal government needs to direct funding, as Julia rightly points out. So we want you to do research in this area or in this area or in this area at a basic level, recognizing as that research matures, it now gets to the point where it now can be advanced through companies into those products and services that we use every day.
Thank you. Mark?
And as a result, from all of that funding and years of funding and research, we can trace nearly all of the technological advancements in the US over these years from basic research that occurs at universities, federal laboratories, research hospitals. Occasionally, there is an invention that is directly relevant, and we can talk about that later. But the foundation of technological advancement in the U.S. is this basic research funded by the federal government.
Thank you. So next question, how do government agencies decide what projects to fund? What are the objectives of the research? Is it basic or applied or developmental? And Mark, given that you have recent government experience,
yes.
why don't you start us off?
So the NIH in particular has panels of experts from outside the NIH who come together and review grant applications. They fund them based on the best science, who has the best science, the best ideas, the best plans for achieving their goals. And out of that, there may be particular programs that are funded, especially in certain areas where the NIH decides there is additional research to be gained or emphasis. But overall, it's based on the best science that is coming in on grant applications.
Thank you. Julia.
That's a great summary, Mark. And I would just say, I think if you drill down a little bit too, oftentimes agencies and those outside reviewers are trying to think about balance in a portfolio. And so maybe they are looking at a portfolio that they want to have a portion of it, what they would consider kind of high risk, high reward research. So those are the things that maybe are less likely to work, but they want to have a section of funding going to some things that are, if they did work, they would be an amazing transformation or a huge step forward in sort of the scientific process. And then they might also want to have a section of a portfolio that they think is kind of a slam dunk. It's going to work, and it's an important incremental step in forming the scientific body. And so that's also one of the considerations, is sort of how likely is this to work and how transformational might it be?
Thank you. Steve, you have anything to?
Oh, I was just going to say, so yeah, I mean, that's a great overview. Again, it's directed research, so directed and chosen by the best science. One of the things that's really interesting, I think, about the federal government is they also are able to drive research forwards by having different types of grants that support different technology readiness levels. So for example, there are particular grants in the United States called SBIR, STTR grants, and those grants are focused on advancing a early stage innovation forward. So I mentioned earlier that much of federally funded research is at the basic science level, but there are these different components and grant opportunities that actually are at the more advanced stage, sort of that valley of death between as far as early stage research gets and when a company wants to come in. There are particular grants that broach that chasm. And so, a couple of examples are grants from the NSF Technology Innovation Partnership TIP Directorate, which help to advance those early stage innovations forwards. SBIR and STTRs are two other examples.
Thank you, Steve. And I think that kicks off our next question pretty nicely. So are the government funding programs for small businesses? And can you describe a little bit about how those work? And Steve, do you want to start with that?
Sure. So I think the question was around what grant opportunities are for a small business. So in the United States, again, we have what's called the SBIR and STTR programs. They're sister programs that are funded by a small percentage of individual agencies. So think DoD, DOE, Department of Defense, Department of Energy, and others. So they have these specific grants, again, SBIRs, STTRs, that are actually applied for by companies that have early stage innovations that they want to de-risk further. So again, early stage research leads to early stage inventions. Those inventions are not fully proven, and I'm sure Catalina will talk about that later in terms of the development stages of that. And so in the United States, the SBIR and STTR programs are designed to provide that key funding to advance that innovation forward, because not all the time it works, but it allows you to de-risk that invention further. And so, the amounts of money you're talking about are $100,000, and they have different phases. So $100,000 to $200,000, up to $1 million or so to advance your innovation further. One of the really nice things about this for the company folks on the call is this money is non-dilutive, meaning the government, this is a grant. There is no equity in return for this. It's really to advance that early stage innovation forward.
Thank you. Julia.
I am less familiar with the diaspora. I think Mark might know other small business programs too, but what I'd say is there is an increasing number of opportunities, I think, for small businesses for points of entry in a way that it hasn't always been the case, in the sense that the federal government was a little more strict about maybe who they were willing to fund. And I think with the creation of things like the Technology and Partnerships Directorate at NSF, there's a broader aperture and more interest in partnerships in sort of regional based economies. And so I do think there are some new opportunities, even if a solicitation might not be directed at a small business. I think there are places where small businesses can get involved in ways that agencies weren't always open to in the past.
And Joshua, if I had jump back in real quick. Again, when we think about where these innovations come, they come from universities. Universities might be based in a state in the United States. And what we at Autumn have been collecting data on the innovation ecosystem since 1991. And one of the things that we've shown is, and no surprise, the innovations that are that lead to the creation of startup companies are about 70% of the time located in the home state, which makes sense because they want to be close to the scientific founders. And so to advance that, again, there's this federal program, the SBIR STTR program, but many states have recognized the economic value of having startup companies located in their states. So you're seeing more and more states that actually have matching programs. So rather than doing their own review, and Mark can talk about the challenge of doing these rigorous scientific reviews, what many states have been doing is they say, hey, if a company in my state receives this federally funded SBIR program or grant, we will match a portion of it. And that's really been a driver on innovation in particular states that, again, has the return to the state in terms of employment opportunities, tax base, and so on. So I just wanted to highlight that it's both at the federal level as well as you're seeing it at different state levels as well.
Thank you, Steve. Mark, anything to add on this one?
Yeah, I would. The program the companies that are eligible for these programs are 500 employees or less. So small business is defined as a US-based company with 500 or fewer employees. So it's not going to big high-tech companies, going to smaller companies. some of which grow into large high-tech companies.
Thank you. Because we've talked a little bit about the government funding research. Obviously, a lot of U.S. companies spend a ton of money on R&D. So what is the role of business in funding research, and how is it different? And Steve, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So really the outcome for industry versus the federal government is just different, right? So the if I look at it from an industry standpoint, industry is trying to create shareholder value. That shareholder value is driven by the products and services it makes available to the public. So they are very driven on particular products and services to get out to the market, which is great. And those are the products and services that we use. And you can maybe compare and contrast that with federal research funding, which is at a much earlier stage. So think, cancer research, for example, the recognition that that we want to address the cancer, we want to address different types of cancer. So there are different grant applications focused on treating those cancers without a very clear outcome yet, right? We don't have the chemical entity that's going to serve as the drug. We're trying to understand the pathways, trying to understand the signaling mechanisms. And that will ultimately, hopefully, lead to a potential drug target or drug candidate. So if you think about that part is sort of the basic research, then companies come in when they've see a technology that's been de-risked or shown to be likely to be successful. That might be a specific chemical entity, and then that company will take that with the focus of advancing that particular compound. So that's kind of maybe the distinction you can see. It's again basic versus very applied, and that's kind of how I'll quickly just kind of separate those two types of funding mechanisms
Thank
and
you.
goals.
Mark, anything to add on that one?
Yeah, I would say the fundamental premise of government-funded research is that it's publicized. The results are publicized and made available to others to grow from that research. So companies don't typically do that. They're typically focused, as Steve said, on their own particular mission. And so it's a different type of research. Not only may it be more basic and more applicable to multiple scenarios, but it's also publicly available for others to learn and grow those scientific findings.
Thank you. And Julia.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that we are getting this question a lot right now, that there is increases in overall R&D intensity in the private sector in the US right now. It's been going up. And so the question out there is, why can't that take the place of some of this federal funding? Why is our ecosystem not essentially healthy? Because the money being spent on R&D collectively is increasing. And the answer to that is, again, based on everything that Steve and Mark just said, it's a different kind of research and development that's taking place. And a lot of time it's more on the D side of it than the R side of it, but it's also with a very intended consequence and a very much shorter timeline. So the federal government R&D has an opportunity sometimes to not have results within a timeline of a year or two, which is probably what your shareholders are going to want to see, maybe even less time than that. The government-funded research has the ability to be a little bit more iterative and sometimes consequential and big leaps, but oftentimes it's 20 or 30 years before you can connect those dots back to where the federal funding started. No company is going to stay in business with those kind of timelines. So thanks.
Thank you. I guess another question which often doesn't come up in this, but I think is worth discussing a little bit. How important is federally funded research for training graduate students and providing the next group of scientists who will be out at the public companies later?
I can jump in on this one to start. I mean, this is something we're really concerned about. There are obviously ways that students are funded through things like direct fellowships and traineeships, but the majority of graduate students in the United States are actually funded on research grants, meaning that their funding is coming usually sort of as a pooled resource from funding that faculty is taking in from the government to do these types of projects and activities. So I think we're very vulnerable if we see big drops in the federal funding for research at universities. And what's happened amongst our members over the last 3 or 4 months, since we anticipate maybe some constraints coming on federal funding, they have chosen to decrease the size of their accepted classes for graduate programs in this coming fall. In some cases, they've even eliminated certain programs, but mostly they're condensing them. And where they might have accepted 12 or 13 physics students, now they're maybe accepting 9 because they want to make sure that they do have funding to support the students. So that's going to have some very long-term effects on how many students are actually going into these fields in the future.
Thank you. Does anyone else have something to add on that one? And Catalina, is that how it works how does that work in your, country? Did you have funding for your research, or was it from the school, or?
Well, most of it was from the university. Some of it was for government, but since COVID, we don't have too much funding from the government on research and development. And for companies, when you are a student, you can apply for a different kind of grants or funding for research and development, but after you are a company, it's so difficult to find funds through the government. You have to find them through other ways.
Thank you. Okay, so now that we've talked a bit about the basics of funded research, let's move to tech transfer, which is often mentioned as the route to advancing early stage federal funded innovations into the products and services of tomorrow. Can we quickly walk through what the tech transfer process is? And why don't we start with Steve?
Sure, happy to talk about something near and dear to my heart. So let's start at the beginning, right? So a researcher receives a grant from the NIH to support a particular type of research. Along the course of that research, perhaps there's the identification of a breast cancer therapeutic. So it's a compound that is thought that, hey, it seems to treat or kill breast cancer cells in a petri dish. Maybe that could be turned into a product, right? So let's just use that as the hypothetical. So that's research that's occurring at the university level. Now, that scientist that developed that, she's brilliant in terms of signaling pathways and all types of research, but probably is not someone that has started a company or recognizes the challenges with starting a company, which is just a whole set of different challenges. So what happens in that case? So what happens is if she might be within a university, she would disclose this invention to the Technology Transfer Office, TTO, and in Europe and other places known as the Knowledge Transfer Office, KTO. And so that invention would be provided to the Tech Transfer Office within the university. Hey, I developed this invention. Looks like this compound seems to treat breast cancer. And I'd like to advance this further because although receiving grants and papers are important, really the reason I got into this is because I actually want to have societal impact and create a therapy that can actually be used. So that's sort of driving this. All right. That invention disclosure goes to the Technology Transfer Office, and I'm going to condense this. The Tech Transfer Office effectively does 3 things. The first thing they do is they evaluate that invention. Is that invention new? Sometimes there might have been a publication on this in a different country years ago. So one, is it new? The second is it protectable? Can you actually protect that invention, or are you just better off just publishing it and going from there? So that's the 2 questions on the evaluation step. And so if the answer is yes, it's new, and yes, it's protectable at some level, often with patents. Sometimes you could use other types of intellectual property protection. Then you go to the next stage, and that is actually protecting the invention. So, and again, the protection often is in the form of patents. And so, why do you do that? You want to protect the invention because that provides an incentive for a company to invest the time, energy, and resources into advancing that innovation further. In the absence of some type of intellectual property protection, really anybody can do it. And if anybody can do it, what often happens is nobody does it. Because they know they spend all the time and energy showing it works, and then 17 other companies come in and with a Me Too approach. And so what ends up happening is these innovations generally aren't advanced. So evaluation, then protection, and then ultimately you want to license, that tech transfer office wants to license that intellectual property out to a company that will actually turn it into that product, because you don't buy Allegra from Georgetown University, but they're actually the ones that developed the active ingredient. You instead buy that from a company, because in the case of Georgetown, they licensed their intellectual property to a company and said, all right, I'm going to put this in the hands of you, company. I expect you to drive this forward for societal impact. And so that's kind of the way tech transfer generally works. Of course, there's lots of other pieces of but that's sort of the overview on why that's important. And the result of that is really remarkable. Tech transfer, you might have not known anything about it before you joined this call, but it impacts every part of your life, from the seatbelt you use to the laser cataract surgery your grandmother might have had, to Allegra, to Gatorade. I mean, there are inventions over and over and over. That the Honeycrisp apple you ate with lunch yesterday came from the University of Minnesota. There are all of these examples of early stage innovation being turned into products that we use every day.
Thank you, Steve. Mark, anything to add on that?
Yeah, so this process in the modern sense is governed by the Bayh-Dole Act of 45 years ago, and the agreement with the funding from the U.S. government is that as Steve very well described, the university would own any inventions made by its scientists. The scientists are inventors; they give rights to the university. The university then would be the owner of the patents and managing the patents. So, and under that arrangement, scientists, when money comes in from licensing, the scientists share in that amount.
Thank you. Yeah, so what rights does the government retain under Bayh-Dole when it funds university and nonprofit research? We talk a little bit about margin rights and government use licenses, which have been a hot topic over the last couple of years, perhaps for the wrong reasons. And Mark, why don't you start there?
So there are two rights, as you mentioned, the government right to use the technology. So the government receives a royalty-free, a free license to use the technology for its own purpose, the patent technology. So that doesn't mean that the government can take it and give it to big company X and have them make something. It only is limited to what the government does itself. Now that might be under a contract, but it's not an arm's length process of giving that license to use the technology to somebody else. Only government uses. So the other is the march-in right. So the government has the right to essentially take away the patent rights and give it to a third party if the technology is not being developed, or if there's an emergency use that the company is not able to address. The discussion in the last 20 years has been raised by some academic lawyers that the law could be used to address high drug prices. The NIH and many others, universities, the people represented here, their groups have said, no, the law does not allow that to be used. You cannot take away through this process a company's patent based solely on the price that they're charged. If you don't like the charge or it's high and people have trouble affording it. But it only is in the case where the technology is not being developed under reasonable efforts. Of course, technologies fail, but if the company is sitting on it, or the university is failing to take reasonable efforts to make it available for licensing, then the government has this right to use it. It's been by the NIH 7 or so cases. 5 of them have been for the high price of drugs, and the margin did not occur. 2 others were for access, and the government was able to resolve those matters without having to use the margin.
Thank you, Mark. Does anyone have anything to add on that one? So, Steve, I think a question for you, at least to start. How do you decide what to patent and what companies should receive licenses? We talked a little about this before, but I think we can elaborate a bit.
Sure. Yeah, happy to do that. So great question. And so the question is really at that evaluation step. So again, invention disclosure comes to the tech transfer office. Tech transfer office needs to decide which resources it devotes to particular applications or inventions, recognizing they can't cover all of them, right? So initially that's done during this evaluation step. Is there a market for this invention? Is it a protectable invention? So that's kind of that will eliminate some of the options because either there is no significant market or there's not a protectable a way to protect that invention in a way that will attract companies, right? So that's one way they do that. The second thing that universities do, and I know one of the questions in the comments revolved around this valley of death. And recognizing that universities can only bring the research so far. Yet a company wants a research that is pretty well determined. And so you've got this gap in between. And so when you determine what do you want to invest in, it depends on your university and the resources you have to advance that innovation further. And so it really is kind of on a case specific basis. Recognize that the inventions that a tech transfer receive are all over the place, right? So they're from the humanities to new types of engineering inventions to therapeutics to AI to alternative energy sources. So the types of inventions are very different. And so the approaches are all pretty unique. There's kind of not just one way to do it, but ultimately the goal of that tech transfer office is this an invention that will create societal impact? If so, can we protect it in a way that we can license it to a company that will drive that forward? And that's really kind of the challenge, because one of the things that's maybe not appreciated in tech transfer is the average number of true licensees for an invention is somewhere between 0 and 1. It's not like 8 to 12 and you just choose your favorite out of those. It's either there is someone who might be interested in the invention, but you got to do all this work ahead of time, or there's not. And so again, to determine which universe or which inventions are pursued by a university, it's what can they move farther down that development pipeline that will make it attractive to a company to drive forward.
Thank you. And so what are some rules of thumb or fallacies around the commercialization of early stage federally funded innovations? And why don't we start with Mark and then Steve and then Catalina, if you want to chime in too, and we'll get to specific examples shortly thereafter.
Well, there's a high rate of failure. That doesn't mean, as Steve was saying, that it means that the level of risk in taking this on is very high. It has has a lot of potential, but a lot of risk associated with bringing it to the market. A lot of money, especially for a product that will be used in humans. A lot of money goes into testing and developing it. And it's a long shot, but it works sometimes. And thank goodness tech companies take those risks, investors take those risks, and we have these technologies that improve our lives and the economy.
Thank you. Steve?
Yeah, so happy to jump in. So I mentioned one of the fallacies, and that is, it's not that that companies are clamoring over these very early stage inventions. They are so risky that a company doesn't want to devote resources to those. And so the university or the research institution really needs to advance those. So that's kind of one of those fallacies, not fully appreciated. Another one is the level of advancement of that innovation when it comes out of a university. So again, it's groundbreaking research. It's developed and no one has ever thought of these ideas, and maybe some of you on the line are in that boat right now, but it's not yet at the stage where it's ready to turn into a product. There are a number of steps along the way. And so there's, I think another fallacy is thinking that that invention is just ready to go. You're ready to put a box around that and sell it tomorrow. That's not how it works. Instead, and again, we talked about it earlier, where that funding comes in for different steps in the innovation pipeline. The university federally funded ecosystem is great at early stage stuff. They'll move it down the pipeline, but not to that it's ready to go. Then it's picked up by industry. Industry invests a fair amount of capital, time, money to drive that forwards into that product. So that's kind of another one. Couple of, you mentioned rules of thumb as well. So again, I mentioned Autumn has been collecting data since 1991. We show in our latest licensing activity survey, so we survey, we have close to 200 universities, research intensive universities across the United States in our last survey. And what we found was on average, about $4 million, $4.2 million leads to an invention in the United States. And again, this is using our population. So that number, we looked at that over since 1991. Those two numbers, research funding and invention disclosures, are virtually parallel. And so what do I mean by that? I mean that research funding and invention disclosures are linear. You increase research funding, you're going to increase invention disclosures. You decrease research funding, you're going to decrease invention disclosures. And again, 4.2 is sort of the average. So I wanted to kind of just highlight that. The last thing I'll mention is just the importance of startup companies. So one of the things, and maybe some of the people on the call have this challenge, is you have a brand new invention that is groundbreaking. It turns science on its head in terms of the approach used. In a normal tech transfer process, that invention would be evaluated, protected, and then licensed out to that company. So if it's a cancer therapeutic, it would be licensed to a cancer therapeutic company, for example. Sometimes these technologies are so cutting edge, there literally is no company to license to. And I'll give the example of CRISPR therapeutics. Right. So CRISPR, as many of you might know, is this really a remarkable technology that allows for gene editing. Right. And so when that was discovered, the normal approach would be you license to a gene editing company, but there were no gene editing companies because gene editing didn't exist. And so instead, because no company was willing to take on this brand new crazy approach, there was the creation of these startup companies, again, that are located within the state, companies like CRISPR Therapeutics, that are actually developed to further advance those very early stage inventions.
Thank you, Steve. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about some successes in government-funded research. And let's start with one of the successes who's actually on the line. So Catalina, I've got a couple of questions for you about your experience. So as someone who successfully brought university-developed technology to market in Latin America, what lessons can you share about bridging the gap between academic research and commercial application, especially in a resource-constrained environment?
Okay, so well, bringing a university-based technology to the market in Latin America requires like a mix of persistent creativity and passion. But I think that one of the key lessons that I have learned is that science, it's not alone, it's just science is not enough. That you need to understanding a real world needs. So for example, from my side, we start looking to solve or research in something that we know that was going to solve a problem that the market has, or a solution that creates value for the clients. So maybe something that it's important for researchers is to, if you want to bring something to the market, you have to start thinking and develop a solution for something that is happening in the market, or for a problem that it's in the market. I think that the perfect match is developing from the university for the market, and carry out the research process thinking that you are going to the market with that solution. Also, in a resource-constrained environment, it's crucial to make a decision that balance innovation with affordability or scalability. At Imetec, for example, we focus on building sustainable operation, validating our technology clinically. So use the funds for that research and validating process, and then bring the products to the market with their own resources that Imetec has. And another important lesson is that the transition from the research to the market demanded not only the technical adaptation, but also understanding if the market is ready for that solution. As Steve was telling before, in some cases, there are no companies that are gonna buy the solution that you have, but maybe starting a company and a startup is the way to go to the market with that solution. That was my case.
Thank you. And another question for you to start, though I think we'll have some others chime in. So why is intellectual property critical for early stage innovation coming from universities? And how has it helped Imetec secure impact, funding, sustainability, and long-term growth without relying on external capital?
Well, okay, I think the intellectual property is essential, not just for protection, but also for looking for that funding and for building credibility and structure around the innovation. We have some products that have a patent, and for example, with those, we had more success on getting funds for that. But we have other products that are, for example, trade secret. So manage a trade secret is harder than a patent. So getting funding for that was harder than for the products that we already have a patent.
Thank you. And following on that, Steve and Julia, you mentioned, federal funded research goes back 80 years. And Mark, we talked about Bayh-Dole being a bit over 40 years. So what happened with federally funded research prior to Bayh-Dole when universities couldn't really license IP? And Steve, why don't you start?
Yeah, happy to lead off on that. So there's actually a phrase for this. So prior to 1980, so again, 80 years ago, the decision was made, hey, we need to invest in early stage research that will happen at universities rather than solely at federal labs or industry. So that was 80 years ago. But what actually was occurring was that research was being conducted at those universities, inventions were being created, but the way the environment worked back then, and so this is before the Bayh-Dole Act, so before 1980, any invention that was developed by a university was owned by the federal government, and the federal government was responsible for commercializing that. That was their goal. And so if you were an inventor at Indiana University, you would write down your invention disclosure, send that to DC, and they'd be responsible for commercializing that. You can imagine how efficient and productive that was. And it actually had a phrase for it. And the phrase was contaminated by federal funding. So industry would identify some very cool invention being created at a university, would reach out, learn more about it. As soon as they heard it was funded by the federal government, they said, yeah, we're not interested. The strings that would be attached into working with the federal government directly were overwhelming. And it was at the point where, prior to the Bayh-Dole Act, not a single invention that was developed at a university and then was advanced or tried to be advanced by the government led to a new therapeutic. Not a single one. Then what happened with the Bayh-Dole Act, and as Mark rightly put, effectively what the Bayh-Dole Act did is it said, hey, university, you could retain the rights to that invention and you can be responsible for licensing that out to companies. Since that happened, 1980, I think the number now is over 200 FDA approved therapeutics have been developed using that model. So clearly it was very effective and allowed us to harness the innovation ecosystem that we had, that we just weren't able to turn that into products and services of tomorrow. And sort of as a coda to this, the Bayh-Dole Act has now been replicated in countries across the globe, recognizing that that really cemented the United States as this innovation powerhouse. Because one, we invest in research. Two, we have an ecosystem that's friendly for the advancement of those innovations. And three, we provide funding and support for these new startup companies and growth opportunities.
Thank you. Mark, do you have anything you want to add on that one?
Yeah, so and because of all that activity, as Steve said, we've gained so much economically and from improvement in public health and public life and those things that we use every day. I'm sorry, I lost the thought of what I was going to say. Go ahead.
Okay, I think we can turn it to audience questions. We have a good number in the chat already, and I'm sure people will continue to add them as we go. So the first question, and I'm going to summarize a little bit, is asking about patent exchange, pools, and holding companies. It's basically, what can universities do with their patents besides trying to license to a particular, company to bring something to market? And Steve, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yes, I'm just reading the question to get a little more context here. What about the patent exchange and the investment of intellectual property holding company and their successes? So how can we benefit from patents that have not been converted into prototypes, products, and commodities? Okay, so ultimately, the goal of protecting that intellectual property is to attract a company that will be willing to invest in that technology and drive that forward, right? So that's why we do it. If we didn't want to do that, we would just publish it and not bother spending the money on the patent application. So really the goal for a tech transfer office is really identifying that company. It's not licensing to a holding company because that doesn't really, it's not the direct route to getting a product to market. That being said, and as many of the scientists on the line know, technology has become more and more multidisciplinary. So there are more and more examples of cross-university interactions where you might have a talented molecular biologist and then someone on the imaging side at a different university. So sometimes you're starting to see pooling of technologies that relate around a certain type of technology, and then that pool is licensed out to a company, and those universities work together, bring those technologies together and license them out.
Thank you, Steve. Mark?
So in terms of auctions and patent pooling, one of the results of having the government requirements and the university requirements to publish results, and scientists want to publish the results, that's how they're evaluated and advance in their careers. It means that unlike companies, the universities have to file a patent if they're going to early, because before the professor has a talk or publishes a paper, companies can wait a little longer and may have a stronger invention in terms of how far it's advanced when they file their patent application, but universities do not. That's one reason it's so hard to to advance, as we were talking about earlier. The technology is so early at the time that you file a patent. It also means that auctions that people have tried generally are not so successful with a lot of technologies because they're so early and so hard to license that they're not going to work in an auction. And the pooling, of course, requires on what kind of technology. If it's for IT, part of a phone, that might work well. But if it's a drug for cancer, that may not work so well in terms of any kind of pooling arrangement.
Thank you, Mark. Okay, the next question, and again, I'm going to paraphrase a little bit, is talking about the trade-offs between licensing to a spin or creating a spin-off company at the university or licensing to a company that already exists. And then also, do universities take into account what the likely profits are from different choices when they're making the decisions? And I think, Steve, you started, and then Julia, maybe you have something to add on that too.
Yep. Yeah. So there are a couple of different issues there. So let me kind of go backwards. So number one, I want to make this point. Technology transfer is focused on impact, not income, right? So when they're licensed to the company that provides the greatest chance of getting that product to market. That's the goal. Whether one company provides one royalty rate and another does another, one is rare, and two, that doesn't drive the opportunity. What drives the opportunity is, do you have the facilities and the expertise to advance that into the product or service of tomorrow? So I wanted to highlight that. I mentioned earlier, it's not like there are often multiple bidders for an early stage technology. So that rarely happens for the starting place. In the case that it might, where you might have a startup company and you might have an established company, it really depends on the university. Some universities in the United States might be a state institution that are really focused on economic development. So the outcome there is a license to a startup company that hopefully is qualified to advance that technology, because that's the bare minimum. You've got to be able to do that. Then that might make more sense to have that company, put up their shingle inside that city or that state and advance it. So that might be an outcome. And in other cases, there might be a large company that's willing and has the resources, the marketing, the distribution, the manufacturing capabilities to advance that further. That might be another opportunity. One thing to highlight, just as a juxtaposition between startups and existing companies. In the case of a startup company, that company's only goal is to advance the technology they licensed, right? They don't license 87 technologies. They license one type of technology. It might be different variations, but one type of technology, and want to drive that forward. In the case of a large company, they might have multiple lines of research. So if, again, your goal is to advance that into a product, a company might have the best resources, but it might not have the most focus on that particular invention. So again, I'm sorry, it's really a specific depending on the technology and the invention. But those are kind of the types of thoughts that come up when you start discussing which route to go with those two.
And I have nothing to add to that. Thank you, Steve.
So I think related question, we talked about early stage companies and startups and federal funding for that. A number of universities have incubators connected to them. Does anyone want to talk a little bit about how the incubators work and what their role in this process is?
I'm happy to lead off. So, we talked earlier, have an early stage invention developed by a brilliant scientist. And then a company wants effectively a finished product, right? They want a product that's been shown to work in whatever the population it might be. Well, you got a big gap there. And so one of the things that's great is the development of these incubators, because it allows that invention to move farther down that development pipeline and make it more and more attractive to a company to advance further. So that's one route. But it's actually a twofer, because those incubators are often populated by those small startup companies I mentioned earlier that might want to conserve their money and just focus on the research and not want to invest in buying space and equipment and all that kind of stuff. So when a university can offer an incubator that is a low-cost opportunity for those startup companies to advance that innovation further. So there are some examples of how that might work driving forward.
Thank you,
And
Steve.
Steve, it also often gets student involvement there too sometimes, right? There's also opportunities for maybe grad students to participate in a way and get exposed to some of these smaller companies. And also the flip side is maybe those companies, if they do grow and get to that next step, they might hire some of those folks. So there's a lot of advocacy there.
Thank you, Julia. Okay. So under typical U.S. university policies, how do employment agreements and funding sources such as federal grants influence IP ownership and commercialization rights? And obviously it changes a lot school by school, but if we can give a couple of examples of how that works, that might be helpful for the audience.
A good example of how a mixed type of policy is used is the University of Wisconsin. So the University of Wisconsin as an institution does not require that its scientists who make an invention give rights to those inventions to the university. However, government-funded research does. So if an inventor uses some other source of funding to make an invention, that scientist and engineer can choose who they want to manage that invention going forward. Whereas if it's funded by the federal government, it's required to be assigned to the university. And Wisconsin in particular has a influential, very successful foundation that manages those on behalf of the university. So the scientist engineer may assign it to the foundation who manages it and license it. But most in the US, because of the federal policy, most universities hold title to the invention. So they require their employees, their graduate students to postdoctoral scientists to assign the inventions to the university. There are places outside the US that are mixed. Canada has some universities who have the institution owning the intellectual property, the patent, and other institutions in Canada do not. So it's mixed. And as we said earlier, that many developed countries in the North and West do have policies whereby the institution owns the invention.
Thank you. Okay, so do you see a need for international harmonization of tech transfer practices to better facilitate cross-border innovation? Or at least do we see benefits from having some harmonization? If anyone wants to chime in on that.
Yeah, so I'll lead off on that one. So harmonization is always a great thing. However, the recognition has to be there that different countries have different environments. And so harmonization that might work within the United States might not work in a particular Southeast Asian country, for example. So we've got some challenges there. Now, WIPO and TRIPS, and there are a couple of those guardrails that allow for general harmonization going forward. Now, the particular question, though, I think was more around tech transfer harmonization. And so I guess the important thing there is, again, we talked about multidisciplinary research. That research is happening at different universities, could be in different countries. And so I think you're seeing more and more of those universities from different countries working together on protecting intellectual property rights in a way that co-owned invention is advanced. So I think you're probably seeing that more at the institution to institution level than you are seeing it from sort of a global perspective. If I take away kind of the WIPO overview in terms of intellectual property protection. That's my take on it.
Thank you, Steve. Mark.
So as Steve said, patent laws are now generally harmonized, but there are some differences in countries. But the process of licensing an invention does pretty much the same, whether the details may vary, but whether I'm licensing from the US to the UK or Colombia or Southeast Asia, the process is the same. The contract laws may differ a little bit, but they're pretty much the same around the world. So at NIH, we license technologies, particularly for use in lower income countries so for example, nearly every biotech company in India had a license from us, Brazil, South Africa, other countries. The process was similar. And universities do the same. If they have a technology that's of greater use of good needs to be developed for use in a lower income country or middle income country, they would license to them. But also, if we cannot, all of us cannot find a company to develop the technology in the US, say the technology, the background technology just doesn't exist in the form of a company in the US, but it might exist in Europe or Asia. We might license then to that company to develop the technology and then be introduced to the US when it reaches the market.
Thank you, Mark. So, as the global momentum for open science and data sharing accelerates, how can the Bayh-Dole Act evolve to support a more open, collaborative innovation ecosystem without sacrificing the incentive that drives commercialization? Steve, do you want to jump in there, or Mark?
I think it is an open, collaborative situation in the United States. Particularly, I mean, one thing that has led to success in tech transfer in the US, not besides the law, is the collaboration. I mean, Steve's organization, Autumn, has been around now for 50 years, and it promoted collaboration between many people in technology transfer to share ideas, share training, and that's been a great success in bringing universities who had less experience, people who had less experience in tech transfer, to grow and become more professional in the field. And overall, it has definitely improved significantly in the last 50 years. So, and the requirement of the NIH, in particular, government agencies and universities to publish their results also means that it tends to be collaborative. Also, joint inventions make it collaborative. I think that shows that there's collaborative. Steve mentioned it. We at NIH had many co-inventions with universities to show that the research was collaborative. Not always, but most often, yes.
Thank you, Mark. Okay. Given the often limited industry presence and investment ecosystems in developing countries, what strategies can tech transfer offices employ to create viable commercialization pathways? Steve, do you want to?
Sure. So there are a lot of different flavors of this, right? So number one, if your local ecosystem might not have the potential licensees, there's the opportunity to license elsewhere, right? Whether that's, the city next door, the state next door, the country next door. So there's opportunities there. If your ecosystem might potentially be limited. Not everyone has a Bay Area or a Boston type, but there's plenty of licensing that happens across the entire United States, regardless of kind of the ecosystem. So I don't think an ecosystem, it might cause challenges at times. I'm not dismissing that, but I believe it's overcome. One of the things that we are seeing more and more of is a engagement of industry earlier and earlier in the process. So I mentioned earlier, kind of the overview of tech transfers. It starts when you get an invention disclosure, you evaluate, you protect, you commercialize, and license out to a company. And again, that's the real abbreviated version. What we're actually seeing is that front end is expanding. And what do I mean by that? Tech transfer offices are actually engaging with companies before an invention's even created and saying, hey, come on to my campus. We have talented scientists. We have amazing resources. We have equipment that is super valuable that your company might not be able to afford or have. We have all of these resources available. How can we help you? So a company might say, well, look, I'm working on a new type of endoscopy tube, and I'm looking for something that does this or acts this way, has these features. Well, now you have these talented scientists, you've got the manufacturing facilities, you've got testing beds to advance that. What we're seeing is that is actually driving industry to work with universities because, again, they're all these great resources. And then when an invention is created downstream, it actually is pretty great because that invention was not developed by an academic absent of corporate perspective, but instead it was driven by corporate perspective. So there's a clear potential licensee, right? So the company that actually funded the work that said, hey, I want it to look like this and have these parameters, and now you develop it that licensing opportunity becomes even clearer and cleaner and more efficient and more likely to get to the market, which again is the overall goal of tech transfer.
Thank you, Steve. I think the question was more for developing countries and what the universities there can do when they don't necessarily have the same company ecosystem that we have here, which
Sure. So fair, and not every country does. But those inventions can be licensed to companies that are multinational companies. They don't have to reside within that individual country, right? So why that might not be the ideal outcome, in the absence of an alternative, that is an outcome. So you mentioned what can countries do? What we're seeing is countries are now developing the ecosystem to cultivate innovations created within their borders. And so I mentioned earlier, countries across the world are passing Bayh-Dole-like legislation. And I say like because Bayh-Dole doesn't fit every country. And there are countries around the world that are modifying it to suit their ecosystem. So I think from a government level, you could actually help grow the ecosystem. One of the reasons why the US has been effective is investment in early stage research, which again, I said, has a linear relationship to inventions. So from a government standpoint, investing in research will lead to inventions. And then having follow-up funding models, like we talked about SBIR and STTR and other types of funding models, to actually de-risk those inventions further and make them more attractive to industry, whether they reside in your country or not.
I think
thank you, Steve.
you need to assess what are your strengths in research, in environmental resources. So if you live in a tropical place, maybe you have a lot of potential collaborations with industry for natural products that come from testing various plants and animals for their traits that might be developed into medical products. So companies are very interested in that. Maybe you have experts in a particular type of technology that would be of interest to a company. The other advice I give to people is if your scientists have collaborations in the US, that's an opportunity to work together and perhaps make a joint invention, and then have the US take the lead, but work with you so that you are seeing the advancement of that technology and the benefits through those type of collaborations. But one needs to be careful in those agreements with universities that they do not take everything away from you. There are experts and nonprofits in the US and Europe and abroad who can help you with those agreements to make sure that you're protecting your universities and country's interest.
Thank you, Mark. So a question, what role should public universities play through innovation ecosystems in supporting regional economic development? Julia, you want to?
Yeah, I'll say something to this one. Kind of as more of a generalist here. I think this is a really good question, and I think the should is an important word here because I do think you get different opinions on how to answer that. But I would point to what has happened at NSF in particular with regional innovation engines and their establishment. A couple of years ago, there was legislation that moved through the Congress called the CHIPS and Science Act. And part of that was to really promote kind of innovation clusters. And a couple different agencies had funding to that end, National Science Foundation set up this program that was pretty ambitious for a relatively small independent agency, and they're kind of experimenting with this. And so we're a few years into what does a regional innovation ecosystem look like that is built around a research component, and that's something that the university brings to the table. Now, I feel like these clusters have often formed organically in the history of our country. And this is a little bit more directed, and it identified for each of these regional innovation engines a persistent regional problem to solve. And so I think that's an interesting aspect of when you ask the question is, what is the role of the public university? You know, there is, I think, in my community, a very much an understanding of the university is very interested in being a part of the community. And so solving a local problem with technology, but built on the research conducted at the university in partnership with all these regional partners, is something I think a lot of universities are becoming more focused on. Steve, I'm sure you have more to say on this front, but that's just a little bit from me.
Yeah, I mean that's a great perspective, and I agree with all of that. I guess one of the reasons I love this question is it actually gets to a core belief of our Autumn members, and that is innovation happens everywhere, but it's only commercialized where, or it's only advanced where resourced. So, innovations happen at MIT and Stanford, but they happen at universities everywhere, including community colleges and elsewhere. But in the absence of having resources to support them, they actually just wither on the vine. And so, because of that, you're actually seeing public institutions create these regional innovation clusters funded by some of the sources that Julia mentioned. I'll mention a couple. So in Wisconsin, there's an organization called WISIS, which is kind of a nice pooled regional ecosystem for Wisconsin, which is a very large state within the United States and pretty remote in areas. And it's a great way to kind of pull that together. Another one that's been really effective is a group called Kentucky Commercialization Ventures, KCV. And they have been tasked with supporting innovations that are occurring at schools outside of the University of Kentucky, recognizing again there's value at those different institutions. So I think that's an area of growth. You can see the challenge sometimes with deploying resources that might be at a particular institution and deploying them for the benefit of other institutions. But from a regional perspective, I think you're seeing more states and regions actually investing in that, whether it's through the federal programs that Julia mentioned or other more localized funding sources. But again, the goal behind all of that is to realize the value that's being developed on these campuses across the region.
Thank you, Steve. Okay. So are current tech transfer practices effectively translating academic research into innovations that benefit marginalized communities in the US?
They are, but it's not as robust as it could or should be because of the challenges that we've talked about in terms of the profit and business that could be developed in sales in lower income areas. It occurs. There's technologies that that Autumn has recognized as valuable for lower income and developing areas of the US and the world. The US Patent Office gives awards for patents that are used to advance technologies for such uses. It's a real challenge. There are some nonprofits who help advance, Gates Foundation, others who help advance such technologies. We could do more, but there is some.
Yeah, I think that's well said, and your core concept, which is it could get better, is true. The one thing I just want to point out though is those innovations. So again, we've got this amazing chest of innovations that are being developed every day. The challenge is getting them to market, and the bottleneck is the companies that will actually advance them further. So again, those universities can't develop them to a place where they could be sold tomorrow. They need to work with the company. And so making that corporate pitch enough that that a company will be willing to take a technology and drive that forward is sometimes the challenge. And that's an area of continued improvement.
Thank you, Steve and Mark. Okay, I see a question from one of our economists in the audience, which I think I'm going to reword a little bit to get at the meat of that. So it's getting to, if there's federal funding as part of innovation, then obviously there's certain rules on licensing for that and who owns the patents. So the question is, if a company is going to uh, fund something at a university, how much control do they have over what other funding might be involved in the projects, and how can they be sure that they're going to actually own the rights versus potentially having some federal rights there with university rights because one of the inventors also has funding from another grant, and like how does the university basically manage all of that, the different funding sources, and make sure not to uh, mix up the pools, I guess, is really what it's getting to. And Mark or Steve, do you want to?
Yeah, I guess I'll lead off.
Yeah,
So
Steve could probably.
yeah. I'll lead off by saying very carefully. There are universities are by nature very leaky. In that a researcher in one lab will often work with the researcher right next door. So you've got those challenges. So I think there's just an inherent challenge that companies need to recognize when they work with universities. Tons of benefits to working with universities. However, universities also are leaky. What that relationship might look like, hey, university, I'm willing to fund you to do this research, but I want you to stay in this lane. Those details can be worked out on a university by company perspective. Um, but I will say that if federal funding is utilized, we are required by law to provide the obligations under the Bayh-Dole Act that Mark pointed out, regardless. So those cannot be contractually overwritten. Is just an important thing. So that's not to dissuade companies from working with universities, just to go in with their eyes open and to keep research projects very focused.
Thank you, Steve. Mark,
I
anything
would,
to add on that?
I would say that also if a company is licensing or collaborating on a technology that was claimed not to be federally funded, do your diligence before your investment to be sure that there were no government rights, or that it wasn't an oversight in not reporting it to the government. Occasionally that occurs, and there are risks to the technology in terms of licensing if it was not properly, if in fact it was funded with government funds in part and was not reported to the government.
Okay, I see one more question in the chat, and we have about 12 minutes left. So if anyone has other questions, we still have some time. So which developing countries are suitable for successful commercial exploitation of their IP, whether patents, copyrights, or others? So I think it's really getting to what other countries are doing, the developing countries are doing well on the tech transfer side. And are there any lessons there? Steve or Catalina, if you want to talk about.
Yeah, I'm happy to lead off, or Catalina.
You can go.
Okay. So you said which countries? I'm going to say all of them, right? So again, innovation happens everywhere. So there are opportunities everywhere. The innovation ecosystem is going to dictate your approach, but there are things to be learned everywhere. And I'll just give one example. within the United States. So we have the Bayh-Dole Act, so great. And so the Bayh-Dole Act says, hey, if you create an invention using federal funding, you need to protect that invention, report that invention, provide a fully paid up license. However, by the way, universities, you need to find your own funding to support the protection of those federally funded inventions. That's just how it works in the United States. Well, Mexico looked at the Bayh-Dole Act and said, oh, there's some parts of that look great. And there are other parts that I think we could actually do differently. And one of the changes that they made is they actually said, hey, that federal funding that supports research, by the way, researcher and tech transfer office, you can use a portion of that research to fund the patent application for that federally funded research. It's our federally funded invention. Of course, we'd want to support federal funding or support the protection of that federally funded invention. So I just highlight that as just that's an example of how multiple perspectives will just create a better and better product. And so again, my answer is those every country will benefit from tech transfer, and it's just a question of how.
Thank you, Steve. Okay, I see one more in the chat, and then we actually have 5 in the Q&A, which I had not been monitoring. So thanks for the reminder on that one. So this was a trade secret question. So why don't universities usually use trade secrets as a form of IP and license them as part of the tech transfer? And what can companies do to work with universities when the technology dictates that the trade secrets are the most appropriate form of IP?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And again, I'll just go back to the inherent leakiness of universities, which is, by design, right? So the design is to transfer information within the institution and then externally, right? So what's the goal of a lot of that research is the publication of those research results. That is in direct conflict with trade secrets. And so for those of you that might not be aware, so patents basically, a patent says, I will tell you everything about my invention. And in return for that, if it's new, useful, and non-obvious, you, the government, agrees that I could be the only one or that I have a right to exclude others from using my invention. So that's what the patent system says. The patent has a limited time horizon, right? So it'll expire over time. And I'll just give an example. Aspirin, acetyl salicylic acid, was patented in 1900. So it was a patented compound. And of course, that patent expired years and years ago. And now it's available to everybody. So that's kind of the patent system. And so the idea is the government says it's a deal, right? So the government says, you tell me everything about it, I will give you, and if you follow the rules of patent law, I will give you a period of time where you have exclusive rights to that, and then after that, the entire world can build off of that, because all innovations really build on each other, right? So that's the patent system. Trade secret system. Think of the recipe for Coca-Cola, right? If the developer of the Coca-Cola recipe actually had patented it, and be challenging to do that, but let's just hypothetically say they did that, they would have that for a period of time, maybe about 20 years, 17, 20 years. And then anybody can make Coke with that recipe. What a trade secret did, and so they went the trade secret route, is they said, you know what, we are going to keep this secret. No one person knows the entire recipe for our Coca-Cola. It's, 17 different security guards and 14 different safes. So they provide all of this protection around that, because if anybody ever figures it out, there's nothing they could do to stop you. So back to the question, why don't universities pursue trade secret protection? And the reason is we can't keep it safe generally. Now, I say generally because in my career, in 10 years at an institution, I actually saw one example of a trade secret. It was a recipe that was actually protected. It can be done. It is just very challenging. And why is it challenging? Because the researcher that developed, let's say, the recipe says, well, I want to publish on it. And then we say, no, you can never publish on it. What do you mean I can't publish on it? I'm going up for promotion. I need to publish on it. You can see the challenge that you have. So long story short, Universities are not very good at all at developing trade secret inventions. However, it can be done under very specific circumstances.
Thank you,
I
Steve.
can add, I want to add something about that because I have a trade secret, and we were able to publish some of the information, not how we made the product or the recipe of it, but we can publish a case report, for example, of patients that have been used our products, our implants, and you can manage the way of you can publish the information, not the recipe or not the secret, but other things that you can do with the technology.
And universities do have information that may not be publishable or published, and they would license it as know-how under agreements that might include intellectual property. They maybe know-how it's licensed along with it.
Thank you. Okay, so we have 5 minutes. We've got a couple of questions left, so we can see if we can answer them quickly for those that at least fit into quick answers. So traditional metrics, patents, licensing income capture only a fraction of universities' societal return on investment. How else should university be measuring, or should we be measuring universities' ROI?
I'll jump in on that, and that's a great question, right? So, so the comment is, hey, we can track certain metrics like number of inventions and number of patent applications and number of licenses, and those are helpful because they're easy to count, but they actually don't show impact, right? It's all about impact. So the question is, how do you quantify impact? And the challenge that the tech transfer community has is, what is impact, right? So impact is different depending on the invention. It could be the number of gallons of milk made, an increase in the gallons of milk made because of a new invention. It could be a longer life expectancy over the years due to therapeutics. So there are all these different ways to look at it. That's not to say it can't be done. It's just challenging. A couple of examples of what impact looks like. One is jobs created. You can actually look at tech transfer and the companies that are formed and the startups that are created and even the licenses that are consummated and turned into products that are on the market. And you could actually determine the jobs that are created, the economic impact. We do a joint study, I'll drop it into the chat in a second. We do a joint study with the Biotechnology Innovation Organization that saw over a 25-year period, nonprofit licensing in the United States accounted for about 1 trillion in GDP and 6.5 million jobs. So that's kind of one indicator of impact. Another one, and I think about quantitative impact, things you can count, and qualitative impact, more kind of stories related. And I'll drop this into the chat as well. Autumn has been keeping a database of 500 tech transfer success stories. So, I mentioned Honeycrisp and Allegra and a bunch of other things. We've got 500 of those stories, and that's another way to show impact of innovation. So I'll drop both of those links in the chat right now.
Steve, I think that's a great answer. If you just zoom out just a little bit too, one of the other things that I know some groups have been exploring is overall research, federal research dollar impact. So if you just look at universities across the nation and you drill down into just not how many research dollars went to the institution, but what those dollars actually support outside of the institution. So you dig into like subcontracts, suppliers that are not necessarily even regionally located, you end up with a lot bigger footprint for jobs that are supported than you would anticipate. And so I think that's kind of an interesting framework that I hadn't seen until the last couple of years.
Thank you, Steve and Julia. I think that there are a couple of more questions, but that's a really good question to end on. Like, why, what's the impact of this? Why does it matter? Which is why we're here today. So I think we're going to end on that question. Though I'll give Steve a minute to make sure everything's in the chat so people have the resources you talked about. And I want to thank Steve and Julia and Mark and Catalina for a great session. Hope everyone enjoyed it and got some questions answered. And we're going to make the recording available online for those who missed part of it and if they want to go back and watch other parts. So thanks again to the panelists and to USIPA and WIPO and IPPI for co-running this session.